The metal tray hit the table with a sound like a gunshot, not dropped, placed, deliberately, with just enough force to cut through every conversation in the mess hall at once. Sergeant Brick didn't need to raise his voice. He never did. He simply pulled out the chair across from the woman sitting alone at the far end of the row, dropped himself into it with the easy confidence of someone who had never once been told to sit down, and leaned forward on both elbows. Specialist Dahlia didn't look up from her supply manifest. Her pen kept moving across the page, column by column, line by line, the numbers steady and unhurried. Around her, the mess hall of Fort Caldwell hummed with the usual morning noise. Boots scraping linoleum, trays clattering, voices overlapping in the low, competitive rhythm of men who hadn't yet had enough coffee to be civil. The breakfast line stretched to the door. Outside, the desert was already warming toward what would be another brutal afternoon. Brick drummed his fingers once on the table. Then he reached across and tapped the back of her forearm with 2 fingers. Not hard, just enough to make the point. "Hey!" Dahlia's pen stopped. She looked up. He was already smiling. The kind of smile that knew exactly what it was doing. "That tattoo!" He nodded toward her right arm, where the sleeve of her uniform was rolled back 2 precise turns above the wrist. The ink was visible from across the room if you knew where to look. A dragon rendered in dense black lines, scales overlapping like armor plates, the detail fine enough to catch light differently, depending on how the arm turned. It ran from the inside of her wrist to just below the elbow, the dragon's head angled downward as if diving. You get that at a street market, or was it one of those drunk spring break situations? From the table to the left, Corporal Floyd didn't even try to hide his reaction. He let out a bark of laughter and slapped the shoulder of the soldier next to him. Jasper, Staff Sergeant, the unit's self-appointed weapons authority, tilted his head and smirked without looking up from his food. A private named Logan, 19 years old and still figuring out which way the social current ran, stared down at his tray and said nothing. Dahlia looked at Brick for exactly 4 seconds. Not the 4 seconds of someone calculating what to say. The 4 seconds of someone deciding whether the question was worth the air it would take to answer. "No, Sergeant," she said. Her voice was flat and unhurried, the way a road is flat. Not empty, just level. "I just didn't find your question worth answering." 1 beat of silence. Then Brick let out a longer, slower laugh, the kind reserved for when something had surprised him just enough to be entertaining. He pushed his chair back and stood, loud enough for the surrounding tables. "Supply clerk with a dragon tattoo! That's terrifying!" He picked up his tray, made brief eye contact with Floyd, who was already laughing again, and walked away without another word. The mess hall laughed. Not all of it, and not for long, but enough. Dahlia folded her manifest, clipped her pen to the top, and slid the pages into her document holder with the practiced economy of someone who had learned to do things right the first time, every time. She picked up her tray, stood, and walked to the return window. Nobody noticed that her hands weren't shaking. Nobody noticed that she walked to the exit with the kind of balanced, grounded step that has nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with training. The walk of someone who has moved through spaces far more dangerous than a mess hall and learned to carry no weight she didn't need. In 20 minutes, everything in that room would look completely different, and what they were about to discover would change the way every person in that yard carried themselves for the rest of their tour. Before we go any further, and hit that subscribe button and stay with us, because Dahlia just walked out of that mess hall without saying a single word. And here is what nobody noticed. She filed a mental record of every name, every face, and every laugh, because that is exactly what she was trained to do. If you want to find out what she's really doing at Fort Caldwell and why Brick just made the worst mistake of his career, subscribe now and keep watching. Drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from today? Specialist Dahlia had been assigned to Fort Caldwell's logistics division for 9 days. On paper, she was a supply specialist, E4, transferred in from a support unit in the Pacific Northwest. An administrative background, no combat record, no decorations of note. Her personnel file was clean, straightforward, and almost entirely unremarkable. She processed manifests. She managed inventory. She reconciled ammunition counts against issuance logs with a thoroughness that her supervisor, Master Sergeant Norbert, had privately acknowledged was at least competent, even if he never said so to her face. She arrived at the arms room every morning at 0530. 30 minutes before anyone else. She didn't turn on the overhead lights. She worked by the ambient gray of pre-dawn filtering through the high, narrow windows, moving through the inventory by memory and touch, checking serial numbers against her own handwritten log with a small flashlight she clipped to her collar. When the rest of the unit began filtering in around 0600, she was already done with her first pass and halfway through her reconciliation notes. Specialist Clover, 22 years old and recently promoted, noticed this on day 3. She was the only one who had tried to sit at Dahlia's table at lunch. Not out of pity. Clover didn't operate on pity. She sat down because the corner seat had good sightlines, and Dahlia clearly wasn't going to use the space for conversation, which suited her fine. What she noticed on that first shared meal was that Dahlia had positioned her chair so her back was against the wall and her face was angled toward the main entrance. Clover had seen that posture once before, in a veteran support group she'd volunteered at in college. She hadn't mentioned it. She'd just eaten her food and kept her own counsel. The mockery had begun almost immediately. Corporal Floyd was the delivery mechanism. Big voice, low-risk tolerance for anything that challenged the established order, and an audience that appreciated his timing. He had spotted the tattoo on day 2 and turned it into a recurring act. In the motor pool, he imitated Dahlia's walk for a group of 7 soldiers and got solid laughs. In the common area, he made a production of stepping around her as if she were something fragile. At morning formation, he stood just close enough that his comments would carry without being formally addressed as insubordination. Dahlia absorbed all of it. She didn't flinch, didn't fire back, didn't report it. She watched Floyd with the same quiet, cataloging attention she gave to everything else. The kind of attention that doesn't announce itself. Staff Sergeant Jasper ran the unit's weapons qualification program and considered himself the definitive authority on anything that fired a round or required assembly. He was technically proficient, genuinely experienced, and constitutionally incapable of letting a moment of potential superiority pass without remarking on it. On Dahlia's 4th day, he cornered her at the arms room desk with the conversational approach of a teacher addressing a student who had wandered into the wrong classroom. "You know the difference between the M4 and the M4A1? Magazine capacity and firing mode, Sergeant." She didn't look up from her log. Jasper blinked. That was the correct answer, delivered without hesitation. He had expected either a blank look or a stumbling recitation. He received neither. He walked away, filed the moment somewhere in the back of his mind where inconvenient data lived, and didn't return to it. Master Sergeant Norbert ran the logistics section with the exacting attention of someone who had spent 22 years building a mental model of exactly how things should work, and had limited patience for anything that didn't fit. He read Dahlia's personnel file on her first morning, twice, and found the absence of a combat patch where he expected one, the unusually clean disciplinary record, the processing number that didn't quite match the standard formatting for Pacific Northwest support units. He called her a desk recruit to the other NCOs in the section before she'd been at Fort Caldwell for 48 hours. Not meanly, just as a classification, the way you label a container before you know what's inside. By the end of the first week, the social structure of the unit had absorbed her as an acceptable target. Not aggressively, and Fort Caldwell wasn't that kind of post, but steadily, in the way these things accumulate. A joke here, a dismissal there, the absence of acknowledgement that becomes its own form of pressure. The mess hall incident with Brick only formalized what everyone had already established. What nobody had established was that Dahlia was keeping records. The notebook was small, the kind sold in bulk at any office supply store, with a black cover and no markings. She kept it in the insole of her right boot beneath the arch support, where it added almost no perceptible thickness. Every evening after her shift, she sat in the arms room under the single operational desk lamp and wrote in a script so compact and angular that it looked less like handwriting and more like a cipher. Names, dates, actions, reference numbers. She used a shorthand system that wasn't in any Army field manual, because it hadn't come from any Army field manual. She had been doing this for 9 days, and the notebook was already half full. On the morning of day 10, Sergeant Carter, logistics section, 3 years at the post and quietly useful to Brick in ways that would eventually prove fatal to his career, walked into Master Sergeant Norbert's office with a printed discrepancy report. 3 boxes of ammunition, he said. missing from Dahlia's inventory section. The numbers didn't reconcile. He had the paperwork. Norbert pulled Dahlia into his office within the hour. He sat behind his desk with the careful neutrality of a man conducting an investigation he already believed he knew the outcome of, and he laid Carter's report in front of her. Dahlia looked at it for approximately 5 seconds. Then she recited from memory the serial number of each missing box, the date each had been logged into inventory, the name and rank of the receiving soldier who had signed for them, and the timestamp on the original intake form, which she noted differed by 12 minutes from the timestamp on Carter's discrepancy report, suggesting the discrepancy had been generated after the fact rather than discovered through normal audit. Norbert checked her figures against the master record. Every number was correct. Carter's report fell apart in under 3 minutes. He dismissed Carter without a word. He looked at Dahlia for a long moment, long enough that the silence became its own kind of question. Then he said, "Dismissed," and returned to his desk. He did not apologize. He did not acknowledge what had just happened, but he sat with it afterward, turning it over in the private space behind his expression, the way a man turns over something that doesn't quite fit the shape of the hole he expected it to fill. Sergeant First Class Blake had been at Fort Caldwell for 11 months, with a transfer order sitting on his desk that would move him to a joint base in the Southwest in 3 weeks. He was the type of soldier who had survived a long career primarily by watching things very carefully and saying very little, a quality that had kept him out of trouble on 4 deployments and made him a moderately useful observer in any unit he passed through. He had been standing near the window of Norbert's office during Dahlia's recitation, not eavesdropping, just present, as he tended to be in the way of furniture that thinks. He watched her walk back to the arms room afterward. She moved at the same pace as always. No visible satisfaction, no residual tension from the confrontation. She rounded the corner and disappeared, and Blake stood at the window for a moment longer before returning to his desk and sitting down without opening any of the files in front of him. Staff Sergeant Ronan had done 2 tours in Kandahar province, the first in 2009, the second in 2011. He ran the firing range now, a job he had requested specifically because it kept him mostly outdoors and required relatively little conversation. He was compact, quiet, and precise in the way that men who have been in bad situations tend to be precise. He had seen Dahlia on her second day at the post, crossing the parade ground with a supply crate, and he had stopped walking. He had looked at her forearm, then looked away quickly, then looked back. He had not said anything. He had filed it the way Blake filed things, in the location reserved for information that needed to age before it could be used. On day 11, he assigned Dahlia to the ammunition check detail for the afternoon's qualification range, a routine task that required no special skills. When she arrived, he handed her the clipboard without ceremony and started to turn away. Then he stopped. "I know what I saw in Kandahar," he said quietly, to a point somewhere between her face and the middle distance. 2009. Dahlia received the clipboard. "I'll have the count ready by 1300, Sergeant." Ronan nodded once. He walked back to the range without looking at her again. The qualification exercise happened at 1400 hours. Norbert had decided, without quite stating a reason, that the logistics section would run a basic marksmanship check. Standard proficiency maintenance, nothing unusual, all personnel required to participate. Jasper had organized the rotation and positioned himself third in the order, which allowed him to establish a baseline score before anyone else shot. He grouped 8 of 10 rounds within acceptable parameters at 200 meters and accepted the results with the modest satisfaction of a man who had never been seriously challenged. Dahlia shot last. She took her position without adjusting the rifle's zero, without requesting a different lane, without any of the small preparatory rituals that shooters use to settle themselves. She fired 10 rounds, slow and deliberate, at 300 meters. When the target came back, all 10 holes were within the central ring, not scattered around it. Within it, the grouping tight enough that from a distance it looked like a single, large-caliber impact rather than 10 separate shots. Logan made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Floyd said nothing. Jasper looked at the target for a long time. Then he looked at Dahlia, who had already set the rifle down and was signing the range log with the same unhurried efficiency she applied to every form she touched. She didn't look up. She didn't make eye contact with Jasper or Floyd or anyone else. She handed the log back to Ronan, said, "Thank you, Sergeant," and walked off the range. The silence she left behind had a different quality than the silence before. It wasn't comfortable. It was the silence of people who are revising something they thought they understood. That evening, Captain Iris, the post's senior medical officer, a careful and observant woman who had been practicing military medicine for 11 years and had learned to read bodies the way other people read weather, found Dahlia in the supply corridor after a wire restraint in the storage room had opened a cut along the side of her right hand. The cut was minor and clean, but regulations required documentation, and Iris had been nearby. She cleaned the wound without speaking, because Iris understood that talking when silence was more appropriate was a form of rudeness. She applied the bandage in the efficient, minimal style of someone who had dressed wounds under worse conditions than a supply hallway. It was the scar on the interior of Dahlia's forearm, just proximal to the wrist, that stopped her hands for a fraction of a second. Old scar tissue, the color of old ivory, shaped in a pattern that Iris had seen twice before in her career. Once at Fallujah in 2006, once in Kandahar in 2010. It was the signature of a ballistic fragment removal, the kind that happened when a fragment was close enough to important structures that the extraction required opening the arm rather than going in small. "What unit were you in before this?" Iris asked, her eyes still on the bandage. "Logistics support, Captain." Iris smoothed the last piece of tape and looked at Dahlia's face. Dahlia looked back at her, not challengingly, just steadily, the way a door is steady when it is solidly hung. "Of course," Iris said. She capped the antiseptic and replaced it in her kit, and she did not ask anything else. But she thought about it for a long time afterward, in the particular private register that experienced professionals use for things they can't yet explain. 2 days later, Blake sat down at a terminal in the administrative section after the rest of the staff had gone to dinner. He entered Dahlia's name and service number into the personnel database. Standard access, nothing he wouldn't have done for any soldier he was curious about. The record came back immediately. Support specialist, unremarkable service history, no combat deployments, transferred from a Pacific Northwest logistics unit. He stared at it. Then he entered her service number through the Joint Service Verification System. The system paused. Then it returned a single line of text. Access restricted. Level 4 clearance required. For record retrieval. Blake looked at that line for a very long time. A supply specialist, E4, with a Level 4 access restriction on her personnel file. He had seen that exactly once before, in 2009 at Fort Bragg. A soldier whose cover assignment had been created by an intelligence support unit to allow operational placement without triggering standard records requests. He closed the terminal, put on his cover, and walked to the window overlooking the parade ground. Dahlia was crossing the yard below, a clipboard in one arm, walking toward the arms room for her evening inventory. He watched her until she disappeared through the door. Then he went to find Iris. It was Clover, unexpectedly, who began to push back first. Floyd had made a comment in the corridor outside the arms room, something about Dahlia's marksmanship score being a statistical anomaly, a lucky grouping, the kind of thing that happens once and never repeats, delivered to a small audience of 2 privates who were uncertain enough in their own social position to laugh along. Clover had been coming around the corner with a stack of supply forms when she heard it. She stopped. She looked at Floyd. "Can you field strip an M4 with your eyes closed?" Her voice was perfectly level. Floyd turned. "What?" "The woman you're talking about. She did it in 47 seconds with a blindfold. I watched." Clover adjusted the stack of forms against her forearm. "I'm asking if you can match that." Floyd's expression went through several changes in quick succession. Surprise, irritation, the calculation of whether this was worth pursuing. He decided it wasn't. He walked away without answering. The 2 privates didn't laugh. Clover filed her forms and said nothing more about it. But that night she thought about the way Dahlia had moved on the range. Not the shooting itself, but the approach to the firing position. The way she had checked her lane with a particular kind of systematic sweep that Clover had seen illustrated in a manual once. A manual that had not been part of any logistics training curriculum she had encountered. And then there was the matter of Brick. He had escalated steadily since the mess hall incident. Not dramatically, not in ways that were easy to report, but consistently, in the manner of someone who had learned that slow pressure is harder to document than sudden force. He had spilled a full coffee across her supply manifests at the shared work table. He had been close enough that it might have been an accident, and he had made the brief, insufficient gesture of someone performing the appearance of an apology before walking away. Dahlia had reprinted the manifests, filed them on time, and written nothing down, at least not on any form that Brick would ever see. Carter had made his second attempt with a falsified discrepancy report. Different box numbers, different date range, the same structural approach as the first. This time, Dahlia produced a counter document, a handwritten parallel inventory log she had been maintaining since her arrival, with every serial number, intake time, and signature recorded in her own notation system. The document made Carter's report incoherent. Norbert reviewed both, set Carter's aside, and looked at Dahlia's notation system with the expression of someone encountering a language they don't speak but recognize as real. The shorthand she used wasn't from any supply management curriculum. The organizational structure wasn't Army. He had seen something close to it once, years ago, in a document that had crossed his desk briefly during a joint exercise, a briefing summary from an element that worked under a designation he had never encountered before or since. He didn't ask about it. He stamped her log as verified and returned it without comment. But the question it raised didn't leave him. It sat in the back of his professional mind, where Norbert kept the things that didn't yet have a category and waited. That night, Sergeant Blake found Iris in the medical facility's break room and told her about the Level 4 access restriction. Iris was quiet for a moment. Then she told Blake about the scar. They sat with both pieces of information in the shared silence of two people who have independently arrived at the edge of the same conclusion and are being careful about whether to step over it. "I saw that kind of scar twice," Iris said finally. "Fallujah and Kandahar." Blake nodded slowly. "Kandahar, Tahar." 2009. That's when the record restriction period starts. They didn't say anything else, but when Blake left the break room, he didn't go to his quarters. He went back to the administrative terminal and submitted a query through a secondary joint database, one that required his own service number as authorization. The query returned nothing usable, but the system logged that the query had been submitted, which meant that somewhere, on a network that Blake had no visibility into, a flag had been raised. The next morning, a petty officer first class named Fletcher arrived at Fort Caldwell with a standard inter-service liaison paperwork package. He was compact and unremarkable in the way of someone who had worked very hard to be unremarkable. No excess movement, no unnecessary expression, the kind of stillness that reads as ordinary until you've been around enough different kinds of stillness to know the difference. He checked in at the gate with Brick, who happened to be on duty, and exchanged a few words. Brick glanced at the paperwork, made a note, and waved him through. Fletcher drove to the visitor quarters, checked in, and walked to the window that looked out over the parade ground. His eyes moved across the yard in a slow, methodical sweep. The kind that doesn't look like scanning but covers everything. They paused on a figure crossing toward the arms room. Small, precise clipboard under one arm. He looked at her for 4 seconds. Then he closed the window blind and sat down on the edge of the bed, and he didn't move for a long time. Logan found Clover in the supply section that afternoon. He waited until the room had emptied, then leaned across the table with the expression of someone sharing something they're not certain they should be sharing. "The MOS field on her personnel file," he said. "It was blank. I saw it on Norbert's desk. I wasn't trying to look. It was just open. I've never seen a personnel file with a blank MOS field. Not a redacted one, not a pending one. Blank." Clover was quiet for a moment. "Don't look at people's files," she said, but she thought about it for the rest of the afternoon. The trap, when Brick laid it, had a certain brutal simplicity. He placed a personal sidearm, a 9mm unregistered, wiped, in the bottom of Dahlia's personal storage locker in the arms room, late on a Wednesday evening. On Thursday morning, before the regular shift began, he submitted an anonymous concern to the chain of command through the post's ethics reporting channel, flagging a possible unregistered weapon in the arms room. The concern was routed to Colonel Raymond, the post commander, a man who had never directly interacted with Dahlia, who knew her name only from a personnel roster, and who was constitutionally disposed toward treating credible weapons violations with immediate, formal responses. Raymond issued a muster order. All personnel in the logistics and arms sections were to assemble at the Central Parade Ground at 1400 hours. The muster was framed as a routine safety inspection, but the word moved through the unit the way significant words always move through a small military installation, fast and slightly distorted, gathering weight as it traveled. By 1355, 62 soldiers were standing in formation on the parade ground. Clover was in the third row, her face carefully neutral. Logan was behind her, hands at his sides, watching the command element near the front. Iris had come from the medical facility when the word reached her, standing near the perimeter with her arms folded. Blake was in the back left, slightly separated from the group the way he always positioned himself when he wanted to see everything without being central to anything. Ronan stood near the equipment shed, motionless. Fletcher stood at the very back of the assembled group, hands clasped behind him, face showing nothing. From where Brick stood, near Colonel Raymond, slightly forward of the formation, he could see Fletcher and gave him a brief, satisfied nod. Fletcher did not nod back, but Brick didn't notice. At 1400, Colonel Raymond stepped forward. He was 61 years old, 38 years of service, the kind of bearing that comes from decades of understanding exactly what rank means and choosing to carry it with care rather than force. He read the formal notification of the inspection, named the specific allegation, and asked Specialist Dahlia to step forward. Dahlia stepped out of the formation. She was smaller than Raymond remembered from the roster photo, though he hadn't looked at it carefully. And now, seeing her in person for the first time, he registered something about the way she stood that he couldn't immediately name. She was at attention, as required, but it was an attention that had nothing performative about it. It was just correct. The way a thing is correct that has been done exactly right for a very long time. Raymond read the allegation. The formation was quiet. A wind moved across the parade ground, carrying dust. "Do you have anything to say before we proceed?" Raymond asked. "Yes, sir," Dahlia's voice carried without effort. "I'd ask that you have someone check Sergeant Brick's personal storage locker, bottom shelf, left side." The formation stayed still. Raymond looked at her, then he looked at Brick. Brick's face went through a rapid series of adjustments. "We are halfway through the story, and you've already watched Dahlia endure 2 weeks of systematic dismissal, dismantle 2 falsified reports from memory, shoot a perfect grouping at 300 meters with no warm-up, and stand in front of a full formation accused of something she didn't do. And she still hasn't raised her voice once, not once. That answer about her storage locker is coming. What that dragon tattoo means is coming. And it is going to hit harder than anything you've seen in this yard today. Stay with us." Raymond gave the order with a single word. "Check it." 2 officers broke from the edge of the formation at a controlled walk, not running, because running implied panic, and Raymond had not survived 38 years in uniform by permitting panic to set the pace of anything. The formation held. Nobody spoke. The wind moved dust across the parade ground in slow, indifferent arcs, and the late afternoon light fell at the angle that makes shadows long, and everything that stands in them look permanent. Brick remained to Raymond's left, with his hands at his sides and his face arranged in the expression of a man working very hard to look like someone with nothing to worry about. The working was visible. His breathing had changed. Not dramatically, but Jasper, standing 3 positions back in the formation, noticed it. The particular stillness of a man who has stopped breathing naturally and begun managing each breath as a deliberate act. Jasper noticed and said nothing, and looked forward again with the focused blankness of someone processing information they don't yet know what to do with. Floyd noticed Jasper noticing. He looked at Brick. He looked away. Dahlia stood forward of the formation, alone, at attention. She did not watch the officers move toward the arms room. She faced forward, the same direction she had faced in the mess hall when Brick made the first joke about her tattoo 9 days ago. The same direction she had faced through every version of that joke and every variation of that dynamic in the time since. There was nothing theatrical about it. It was simply the direction she had chosen, and she looked there without effort, the way a compass needle points north without effort, not because it is trying, but because that is the nature of what it is. Logan, 3 rows back, watched her shoulders. They were level, not braced, not tense, level, the way a table is level when it has been built correctly. That detail stayed with him. Through everything that came after, through every version of the story he would tell about that afternoon for the rest of his career, he always came back to that detail first. Her shoulders were level. The officers returned in 4 minutes. The first carried an evidence bag. Inside it, a 9mm sidearm personal model, not military issue. the kind of weapon that has no legitimate reason to be in a military arms storage facility. The second officer carried a second bag. Inside it, a USB drive, small and black and completely ordinary looking, the kind that sits in a drawer in any office in the country and is unremarkable in every setting except this one. They brought both to Raymond. He looked at the first bag, then the second. The line of his jaw shifted by approximately 2 millimeters, which was, for Raymond, the equivalent of a significant visible reaction. He looked at Brick. The sound Brick made was not a word. It was the space before a word, the intake of breath that precedes language when the language hasn't formed yet because the mind is still catching up to what the body already understands, has gone wrong. "That's not," he began. "Sergeant." Raymond's voice was quiet. The quietness was the most significant thing about it. The quietness of a man who no longer needs volume to establish the weight of what he is saying. "Step out of formation." Brick stepped forward. His face had passed through the mask of performed calm and arrived somewhere beneath it, the rapid, visible restructuring of a plan losing its foundation, strut by strut in real time. Raymond turned back to Dahlia. "Specialist, you knew this was there." "Yes, sir." "How long?" "Since the morning after it was placed, sir." A pause. The formation stayed absolutely still. "And why didn't you report it immediately?" "Because a report without documentation would have been my word against his, sir." Her voice carried to every person in the yard without being raised. "The USB drive in Sergeant Brick's locker contains communication records, encrypted, time-stamped, cross-referenced against external contacts going back 47 weeks. The chain of documentation is complete and independently verifiable. A premature report would have given him the opportunity to alter or eliminate it." She paused for exactly one beat. "I have been building that documentation since day 3, sir." The silence that came after this was different from the silence before it. It was the silence of 62 people simultaneously revising something they thought they understood, and the revision happening all at once, and the resulting stillness being not comfortable, but necessary. The stillness of recalibration. Raymond looked at Dahlia for a long time. He had been reading people for 4 decades, and he was genuinely good at it. He looked at this small, quiet woman who had spent 9 days in his supply section absorbing mockery and falsified reports and deliberate sabotage, while apparently running a parallel intelligence operation from the insole of her boot, and he found that his usual instrument for reading people had reached its range limit. Not because she was concealing something from him, because whatever she was operating from existed at a depth his calibration had not been built to reach. "Take Sergeant Brick to the processing center," he said to the 2 officers. "Secure the evidence, no outside communications until I authorize them." Brick's hands were zip-tied efficiently, without drama, and he was walked off the parade ground. He passed Floyd, who looked at his boots. He passed Jasper, who looked at the middle distance. He passed Carter, who had gone the color of concrete left too long in weather. He passed Logan, who watched him with the expression of a person recalculating a large number and finding the answer was not what the equation had promised. Brick looked at none of them. He looked at the ground 3 feet ahead of his boots, and he walked, and the gate at the far end of the yard closed behind him with a sound that was entirely ordinary and entirely final. It was Ronan who moved first. He came out from the equipment shed, not called, not ordered, simply moving as though it were the only natural thing remaining to do, which was how he made most of his significant decisions. He walked to Dahlia and stopped in front of her. He came to full attention. His right hand came up to the brim of his cover in a salute that was precise and deliberate and completely genuine. The salute of a man who has been waiting to render it for a long time and intends to do it correctly. He held it. From the back of the formation, Logan said, barely above a breath, to no one in particular, "Who is she?" Nobody answered, but the answer was already in motion, rising toward the surface the way pressure eventually finds a way through. Fletcher walked forward from the back of the formation. He moved through the assembled soldiers with the unhurried, singular purpose of a man who has been waiting in position long enough and has now chosen to stop waiting. The crowd opened for him without quite understanding why. Something in the quality of his movement created that parting, the way a current in water makes a visible line on the surface even before you understand what is generating it below. He stopped beside Ronan. He reached up with his left hand and pushed his sleeve to the elbow. The tattoo on his forearm was the same dragon, the same dense black lines, the same scale pattern, each plate overlapping the next with the painstaking detail of something rendered by someone who understood what it represented and was not willing to render it quickly. The same head angled downward, the same mouth closed around the same broken sword. Around the dragon's neck, in the same compact serif numerals, 0711 kilo. Below the dragon's underbelly, in the same blue-black ink that lived on Dahlia's arm, 4 words. Ghost River, 4 walked out. The same 4 words, the same ink, the same irreducible weight. Fletcher came to attention and raised his right hand in a salute. Jasper, standing 6 positions back, made a sound that was not a word and not a breath, and was not something he had made before. His hand went involuntarily to his own forearm, a checking gesture, confirming the absence of something he had never had, and was only now beginning to understand the significance of not having. Floyd had gone completely still. He was looking at Fletcher's tattoo with the expression of a man who has just been handed a map and discovered it is a map of a country he did not know existed, which means every map he has been using until this moment has been a map of something else entirely. Raymond looked at the number on Fletcher's arm, 0711 kilo, and something moved through his face. Brief, internal, the kind of event that does not reach the surface but reorganizes what is beneath it. He had seen that designation once before, 2 years ago in a secure room on a single page of a post-operational summary filed under a compartmented access program with a name he had not been cleared to know. The page had listed 4 survivors identified only by designation. No names, no photographs, no ranks. He had read it, returned it to the person who had handed it to him, and walked out of the secure room believing he would never encounter any part of that document again. He looked at Dahlia. Colonel Raymond stepped down from the command platform. He walked across the parade ground, 12 steps, neither fast nor slow, and stopped 1 meter in front of Specialist Dahlia. He drew himself to his full height, squared his shoulders, and brought his right hand up to the brim of his cover in a salute that was formal and correct and unmistakably genuine. Not the salute of a commander acknowledging a subordinate, but the salute of an officer recognizing service that has exceeded what rank can measure. He held it. Blake, standing in the back left corner of the formation, raised his hand without making a conscious decision about it. The hand simply rose, the way a hand rises when it knows what it should be doing before the mind catches up. Iris, at the perimeter, pressed her palm flat against her sternum for 1 beat before straightening to full attention and bringing her hand up. Logan's hand went up before he fully understood why, which was, in its own way, the most honest salute on the parade ground that afternoon. Then it moved through the formation, not by order, not by signal, but by the same transmission that moves any genuine thing through a group of people who are paying attention and have not lost the capacity to respond to what is real. Ronan was already holding his. Fletcher was already holding his. The corporal from the motor pool who had laughed at Floyd's imitation in the corridor raised his hand with the particular expression of someone paying a debt they did not know they owed. 3 soldiers from the second row, a specialist from the communications section. One by one, until the entire formation was at attention, hands raised, in a silence that was not empty, but full. Full of the specific weight of recognition given freely, without compulsion, to someone who had not asked for it and would not have asked for it. Dahlia looked at the formation, not with triumph, not with the surface satisfaction of a reversal, with the same level, steady quality that had been the first thing anyone noticed about her and the last thing any of them had understood. She looked at 62 people holding a salute that nobody had ordered, and she raised her right hand. Her sleeve fell back. The dragon tattoo caught the afternoon light, the scales, the broken sword, the numbers, the 4 words standing in the blue-black ink that did not fade, because the person wearing it had not permitted it to fade. She held the salute for exactly as long as it deserved. Then she lowered her hand. Raymond lowered his. The parade ground stayed quiet. Around them, Fort Caldwell continued its ordinary late-afternoon operations. Vehicles moving on the perimeter road, voices in the distance, the mechanical sounds of a working military installation. None of it touched the particular stillness in the center of the yard. We are at the final stage, and what is coming will not just resolve everything you have watched build across this story. It will leave you with questions that have no easy answers. Stay with us. How long did you know? Raymond asked. His voice had shifted. The formal register had moved aside and something more direct had come forward. About Brick specifically? Since day 3, sir. About the full scope of what he was passing and to whom. I confirmed that 6 days ago. You were placed here to investigate him. To confirm and document, sir. The investigation had already identified the unit. My placement was to close the chain of evidence before the subject could be moved or the communication channel altered. Raymond processed this. Who authorized your placement? I'm not in a position to discuss that at this clearance level, sir. The relevant command elements have been notified. You'll receive a formal briefing through appropriate channels within 48 hours. The phrase moved through the formation, the way a current moves through water. Subtle, but felt by every person it passed through. Appropriate channels spoken by an E4 logistics specialist to a full colonel in front of 62 witnesses meant something very specific. It meant that whatever clearance Raymond held, the authorization chain above Dahlia's operation went somewhere he could not see from where he was standing. And Raymond, who had spent 38 years learning exactly where the edges of his visibility lay, understood precisely what that meant. It was Norbert who stepped forward next. He walked from the formation without being called, the second person to do so voluntarily, after Ronan. He stopped in front of Dahlia, and he did something that everyone present would retain with precision, because it was the kind of moment that resists forgetting. He nodded. Slow, deliberate. Lower than a professional nod, lower than the nod between equals, lower than anything that could be mistaken for a routine acknowledgement. It was the nod of a man settling a debt that he is only now fully calculating the size of. It was the closest Norbert had come to an apology in 11 years of command authority, and every person in the formation understood exactly what it was. Raymond dismissed the formation. The soldiers dispersed, not with the usual energy of a group released from attention, but slowly, in small clusters, moving the way people move when they are leaving a place where something permanent has happened, and they are trying to carry it carefully. The conversations that started were low and careful. Nobody laughed, nobody performed anything. Floyd walked with his head down, not as performance, but as process, working through something that was going to take longer than an afternoon to resolve. Jasper walked alone, which was not his usual mode of movement. He was the kind of man who organized himself around being observed, and walking without audience through a dispersing crowd was its own form of exposure. He didn't look at anyone. Carter had already been escorted to the processing center before the last soldiers cleared the yard. He would not return to Fort Caldwell. Logan caught up with Clover at the edge of the parade ground. They fell into step without planning to. I thought Fletcher was messaging Brick, Logan said. When he arrived and they nodded at each other at the gate, I thought he was the connection. He was messaging Colonel Raymond, Clover said. I think he has been in contact with Raymond since the day he arrived, probably before. Logan was quiet for a moment. So the whole thing was already finished, Clover said. What we watched today was the last 10 minutes of something that started months ago. We were the location, not the operation. They separated at the intersection of the administrative block and the supply corridor, and Logan walked toward his quarters with the specific sensation of having stood very close to something large, and only now, from a slight distance, beginning to understand its actual dimensions. Iris found Dahlia in the arms room 40 minutes after the formation dispersed. The overhead lights were off, the space lit by the single desk lamp. Dahlia was at the inventory desk with the black notebook open, her pen moving in the angular, compressed script that was not from any military manual. Iris set a folded piece of paper on the edge of the desk. What is this? Dahlia said without looking up. Trauma counseling contacts. Not because I think you need direction toward it, because I think you know when you need it, and having the information available is different from not having it. Iris paused at the door. The scar on your forearm, Fallujah pattern in the location, but the depth and angle suggest the Kandahar timeline is the relevant one. You have a good eye, Dahlia said. I have a long memory, Iris said. She left. Dahlia looked at the folded paper. She placed it carefully in the front pocket of the notebook and returned to writing. Blake went to Raymond an hour later. He knocked, entered, and stood across the desk with the bearing of a man who has chosen his words before he arrived. "The Level 4 access restriction on her file," Blake said. "2 nights ago, I submitted a query through the joint database. This morning, I received a response through a secondary administrative confirmation system I've never seen routed through that terminal before. It confirmed her placement as a legitimate classified operational insertion. The authorizing organization's designation was redacted, but the confirmation code matched the format used by Joint Intelligence Coordination elements." Raymond waited. "The confirmation was dated 4 months before she arrived at Fort Caldwell, sir." Raymond sat with this for a moment. "She was here 4 months before she arrived." "In the planning phase, sir." Raymond leaned back. He thought about the 9mm in the evidence bag and the USB drive and Brick's collapse in front of 62 people. He thought about a woman who had spent 9 days absorbing deliberate humiliation while quietly dismantling the intelligence leak that had required a classified operational insertion to address. He thought about what that required, not tactically, but as a human proposition, what it required of a person. 48 hours, he said. The briefing comes in 48 hours. Until then, evidence locked, documentation clean, and every person in that formation understands that what they witnessed is not for open discussion. "Yes, sir." "And Blake," Raymond looked at him directly, "tear up the transfer order. I need you here for 60 more days." Blake's face settled into a slightly different arrangement. The arrangement of a man who has been useful in a way that matters and has been recognized for it without ceremony, which is exactly the kind of recognition that carries weight. The mess hall that evening had the same furniture and the same lighting and the same institutional sounds, but the current running through it had reversed. When Dahlia came through the door with her tray, the particular beat of assessment that had greeted her for 9 days, the moment of classification, of deciding whether she was worth acknowledging, did not happen. Logan stood from the table near the window without ceremony and moved his tray to make room at the wall-side seat, the one with the sight lines to the main entrance. He did it without making eye contact, as though it were simply the obvious arrangement of the available chairs, and sat back down immediately. Clover was already there. She slid her own tray to the left. A corporal from the second row of the afternoon's formation, one of the 3 who had laughed with Floyd in the corridor, carried his tray over and sat down without asking, with the expression of someone making a small but specific correction. Then a specialist from the communications section, then one of Iris's medics. Dahlia set her tray down. She sat with her back to the wall and her face toward the entrance and ate her food, and nobody at the table tried to make her be anything other than what she was, which was exactly what she needed. At the far end of the room, Floyd sat alone with his food and his thoughts and the particular gravity of a man beginning to understand that the version of himself he has been performing is not the version he wants to still be operating, as in a year. It was not a comfortable understanding, and it did not resolve that evening. But it started there. Jasper sat 2 tables from Floyd, also alone. The space between them held the specific silence of people who have been performing together for a long time and have just discovered the audience has understood something they didn't intend to communicate. Ronan found Floyd in the corridor after dinner. He stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. Not forceful, just present. "Jasper asked me today about Ghost River," Ronan said. "I told him he didn't have the clearance to know about it, but that he had enough clearance to be ashamed of himself." He looked at Floyd steadily. "I'm saying the same to you, not as punishment, because it's accurate, and accurate things are more useful than comfortable ones." Floyd looked at the wall, then at Ronan. "What did she actually do over there?" "You don't have clearance for the specifics," Ronan released his shoulder, "but I'll tell you what I can. In Kandahar 2009, a photograph circulated through our element as part of a post-operational brief. Low-resolution, distance shot. A small person carrying someone twice their size across broken high-ground terrain in total darkness. No equipment, no support element, no visible route." He paused. "I never knew who it was. I have a better idea now." Floyd said nothing. Ronan walked away and the corridor settled back into silence, and Floyd stood with something he was going to have to figure out what to build from it. The next morning, Floyd went to the arms room before his duty shift. He knocked on the open door frame. Dahlia was at the inventory desk under the lamp. She looked up. Floyd stood in the doorway with the expression of a man for whom apology is genuinely unfamiliar territory, not because he lacks the capacity for it, but because he has rarely been in a position where the need for it was this unambiguous. He opened his mouth once, closed it. Then, "I'm sorry for everything I said, the mess hall, the corridor, all of it." Dahlia looked at him for a moment. "Don't apologize to me," she said. He understood. He nodded once and walked away, and 20 minutes later he was standing outside Clover's duty station, and Clover looked at him and said, "I accept it," and returned to her paperwork. And that was the end of it, and also the beginning of something else. Jasper went to the range and asked Ronan something he had never asked anyone in 11 years of weapons work. He asked to be shown what he was doing wrong. Not whether he was doing something wrong, and he had moved past that formulation, just the specific errors and how to correct them. Ronan studied him for a long moment, then said, 0600 tomorrow. Bring your own ammunition." Jasper said, "Yes, Sergeant," and walked back to his section. And for the first time in a long time, he was thinking about his work rather than his standing. The processing interviews with Brick ran across 2 full days. The documentation they produced cross-referenced against the USB drive's communication records, which contained 47 weeks of encrypted transmissions to a contact outside the continental United States, was transferred through channels that bypassed Fort Caldwell's administrative system entirely. Raymond was informed of the transfer, but not shown the destination. He accepted this with the equanimity of a man who has spent enough years understanding where the edges of his visibility lay to know that acceptance, in certain situations, is not weakness, but precision. What he was shown at 48 hours exactly was a briefing document. Fletcher brought it in a sealed folder to a secure room with no active outside communications, and Raymond read it alone. He read it twice. Then he sat with it for several minutes in the silence of a man who has been given a piece of information that reorganizes a significant portion of what he thought he understood. Not because the information is shocking, but because it clarifies something he had been looking at from the wrong angle for a long time. He summoned Dahlia to his office at 1500 hours. She arrived at 1500 exactly, not early, not late, and stood across his desk in the way she stood everywhere, which was correctly and without performance. Raymond placed an envelope on the desk between them. Inside it, a formal document, a promotion authorization, E7, bypassing the standard review cycle with a concurrent reassignment to a joint intelligence coordination element. The signature on it was from a level of command Raymond had interacted with twice in his career. The date on the document was 4 weeks old, written before the USB drive had been secured, before Brick had been removed from the yard, before any of the visible events had occurred. They had written the promotion order in advance, on the basis that the operation would conclude the way it had. That kind of confidence comes from watching someone work and understanding exactly what they are capable of. "I'll consider it, sir," Dahlia said. She did not pick up the envelope. Raymond looked at her. "What you did here, the way you did it. I have been in this uniform for 38 years, and I don't have language precise enough for it. It was my assignment, sir. It was more than your assignment." She thought about this for a moment, genuinely considered it, which was visible in the brief shift in her expression. Maybe, but the assignment was the part that needed to get done. She paused. "With the Colonel's permission, I still owe the section a month-end variance report." Raymond looked at her for a long moment, and something moved through his face that was not quite a smile, but was the internal equivalent of one, real and private, and not requiring expression. "Dismissed, Specialist." She left the envelope on the desk. The afternoon was cooling when Fletcher found her crossing the yard. He fell into step beside her without announcement, the way people fall into step who have walked together in places where conditions didn't permit much conversation and have learned to cover ground as efficiently as possible. "Blake is staying 60 more days," Fletcher said. "I know. Norbert filed a commendation for Clover this morning. Didn't state the reason. Good." They walked in the quiet that belonged specifically to them, the quiet of 2 people who have survived something together and don't require speech to confirm what it was. The post moved around them, a vehicle passing on the perimeter road, voices from the direction of the range, the ordinary sounds of a working installation going about its afternoon. Fletcher reached into his pocket. He held out a coin. Challenge coin, SEAL Team 6, the size of a silver dollar, the weight of something considerably larger. The back of it was engraved with the number 0711 kilo. He held it flat on his palm between them. "From the other 3, he said. "They wanted you to have it." Dahlia looked at the coin for a long time. The light caught the engraving and made the numbers stand in low relief. She thought briefly and precisely about Kandahar, not the whole of it, but one specific moment. The weight of a man twice her size, and the texture of the terrain under her boots, and the particular quality of that night's darkness, which had been total, which had offered nothing in the way of guidance or visibility, which had required movement by memory and calculation and the simple refusal to stop. She thought about what that moment had cost and what it had preserved, and whether those two things could ever be entered on the same ledger. She took the coin. She turned it once in her fingers. Then she placed it in her left breast pocket and closed the button over it. "Tell them I'll use it," she said. Fletcher nodded. They reached the end of the yard. He turned toward the visitor quarters. She turned toward the arms room. Neither of them said goodbye, because that was not the grammar of their relationship. Logan was waiting outside the arms room door. He was standing with the posture of someone who has rehearsed something and is now not certain the rehearsal was adequate, which is the most honest posture available to a 19-year-old soldier asking for something from someone who has no obligation to give it. "Can you teach me to field strip the M4 blindfolded?" He said it quickly, then held his ground. "I know you don't owe me that. I know I didn't do anything useful when I should have. I'm not asking because I think you owe me anything. I'm asking because I want to actually be worth something to this unit. And I think you're the only person here who will tell me honestly whether I'm starting from the right foundation." Dahlia stopped in front of him. She looked at him with the level, accurate attention she gave to everything. Not unkind, not warm, just precise. 0500, she said. "Bring your own blindfold." Logan's face moved involuntarily in the direction of something that had been building since the afternoon and had not yet had anywhere to go. He said, "Yes, specialist," and walked away with the step of someone who has been given a direction and is already moving toward it. Ronan appeared from the direction of the range equipment shed as Dahlia reached the arms room door. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her with the direct, economical expression of a man who says what he means and uses only the words required. "Real warriors don't advertise," he said. Dahlia looked at him. "No, Sergeant, they just work." Ronan held her gaze for one beat. Then he nodded. "Final, the way you close something that is complete," and walked away without looking back. Dahlia went inside. She sat at the inventory desk. She turned on the lamp. She opened the black notebook to a fresh page. For a long moment, she didn't write. She held the challenge coin in her left hand and felt the engraving under her thumb, the number, the designation, the 4 words. She thought about what 4 meant when the number had started as 6. She thought about the 2 who had not walked out. She thought about what a door is and what a door requires. Who turns the handle and who tells the person at the handle that it is safe to turn? She thought about Brick, about the 47 weeks of transmissions on the USB drive, about the external contact whose designation appeared in 63 separate communications, but whose name had not yet been confirmed by any document in the evidence chain, about the fact that Brick had been a component, and components do not generate themselves. She uncapped her pen. She wrote a name. The name was not Brick's. She closed the notebook, removed it from the desk, and placed it in the insole of her right boot. Then she turned back to the variance report and worked through it column by column, with the thoroughness she applied to every document she touched, and the arms room was quiet and ordered and lit by a single lamp, and the work proceeded at the pace the work required. Outside, the post settled into its evening operations. The mess hall completed its dinner service. The common rooms filled and gradually emptied. The guard rotation changed at 2100, and the new guard began his circuit of the perimeter road with a flashlight making slow arcs through the dark. Clover passed the arms room corridor on her way back from the common room at 2220 and saw the light under the door. She stopped. She stood in the dark corridor with the thin strip of amber at her feet and thought about the woman on the other side of it, about everything she had witnessed in 9 days that she had not fully understood until today, and about the things she had understood but had no framework for until today, and about the photograph she had given Dahlia that afternoon. She had taken it on day 3 with a disposable camera she kept in her bag for no reason she could articulate, just a habit of preserving things before they changed. Dahlia at the corner table, back to the wall, face toward the entrance, lit by the overhead in amber and shadow, alone in a room full of people who had decided not to see her. She had printed it at the post exchange and carried it for 6 days before giving it to Dahlia after the formation, with the vague explanation about capturing things before they changed. And Dahlia had looked at it, really looked, with the full attention she gave to everything, and said, "Before what?" And Clover had said, "Before everything changes." Standing now in the corridor, Clover thought about the blank MOS field on the personnel file that Logan had described. She thought about the way Dahlia had said 0500 to Logan without hesitating. The immediate, decisive quality of it. The quality of someone who has been teaching people since before Logan was old enough to enlist. She thought about the name that might be written in a notebook that no one else was ever going to read, and about the vehicle that had been parked outside the post gate since 2100, and about what came next. She didn't knock. Whatever was in motion on the other side of that door was already in motion, and the most useful contribution she could make was to not interrupt it. She walked back to her quarters through the quiet of the post at night, passing the motor pool and the range access road and the gate where the guard was completing his circuit. Everything looked the same as it had looked 9 days ago. The buildings were the same buildings. The ground was the same ground, but it was not the same post. The human architecture of it, the invisible structure of who people were to each other, and what they believed they were worth and what they permitted themselves to assume about others, had been revised. And revision of that kind does not reverse. The building stands, the walls stay up, but the load-bearing assumptions have been replaced, and the structure holds differently afterward, differently and better, if the revision was done correctly. In his quarters, Fletcher sat on the edge of his bed in the dark. His phone was in his hand. He had sent the status message 40 minutes ago. Phase complete, documentation transferred, asset secure, and the response had come back in under 2 minutes, which was fast even for that particular network. Next engagement window, 3 weeks. He sat with that timeline and thought about the name that was probably written in a small notebook in a boot insole in the arms room. He thought about the external contact in the USB drive's communications. 63 transmissions, no confirmed identity, access to information that required either very high clearance or very good sources at that level. He thought about the particular kind of operation that would be required to reach that contact, and the kind of person it would require to run it, and the fact that there were not many people in the world who could do it, and fewer still who had already demonstrated the capacity to do it, while simultaneously absorbing 9 days of deliberate humiliation in a military mess hall without breaking cover. He had been in 12 operations. He had worked beside extraordinary people, but this particular quality, the capacity to be completely invisible in exactly the way the situation required, while simultaneously executing the most complex and necessary work in the room, he had encountered it twice in his career. The first person who had possessed it had not walked out of Kandahar. He went to the window and looked toward the arms room where the light was still on. Then he went back to the bed and lay down in the dark and did not sleep for a long time, thinking about 3 weeks and a name in a notebook, and the second link in a chain that had more links in it than Brick had ever known. The arms room light burned until 22:47. At 22:48, it went out. In the parking area beyond the main gate, the vehicle with no license plates had been waiting since 2100. The engine was off. The lights were off. It held its position with the patience of something that knows what it is waiting for and has calculated that what it is waiting for will arrive precisely when it is ready, and not before. Inside the arms room, Dahlia closed the variance report. She reviewed it once, her eye moving down each column with the speed of someone who has internalized the structure so completely that verification requires almost no time. She signed the bottom, dated it, placed it in the outgoing tray. She turned off the lamp. For a moment she sat in the specific dark of a room that knows its own contents. The ordered geometry of stored equipment, the faint metallic smell of cleaned weapons, the silence of a place where things are kept in their correct locations and accounted for completely. She took the challenge coin from her breast pocket and held it in the dark, feeling the numbers under her thumb one final time that evening. 0711 Kilo, Ghost River. 4 walked out. She put the coin back and closed the button. Then she said quietly, not to the room, but to the 2 names that lived in a permanent, undisturbed location in her memory. The 2 names that had not appeared in any post-operational summary and would not appear in the documentation chain she had just closed. 4 walked out, Time to find out who opened the door. She stood. She picked up her document holder and her cover. She walked to the door, opened it, and stepped into the corridor where the overnight lights ran at their low amber setting. Steady, economical, the light of a place that never fully rests. She walked the length of the corridor at the pace she walked everything, unhurried, grounded, leaving nothing behind her that she hadn't meant to leave. At the far end, through the window beside the external door, she could see the parking area beyond the gate. She could see the vehicle without lights. She could see the guard completing his arc with the flashlight, passing the gate, turning away toward the north perimeter. She didn't break stride. She pushed through the external door into the night air, which was cool now, the desert having released the day's heat into the dark. She walked across the yard toward the gate with the same steps she had used to cross every yard and every road and every broken stretch of terrain, in every operational context she had ever worked in. Balanced, quiet, covering ground without announcing it. The guard turned back from the north perimeter and saw her. He recognized her face from the formation that afternoon. He held the gate open without being asked. She walked through. The vehicle was 40 meters ahead. As she approached, the driver's window came down and a hand extended briefly, a confirmation gesture. Nothing more. She got in. The door closed. The vehicle pulled out of the parking area without lights until it reached the access road. Then headlights came on and it turned north, and Fort Caldwell receded in the passenger mirror until it was just lights behind a perimeter fence, and then just a glow on the flat dark of the desert, and then nothing at all. In the vehicle, a folder sat on the center console. Inside it, a single page. On the page, a name. The same name that was written in a small black notebook, currently riding in the insole of a boot on the floor of the passenger seat. Below the name, a location. Below the location, a date. 3 weeks from today. Dahlia looked at the page in the illumination of the passing road. She looked at the name. She thought about Kandahar and about the door that had been opened by someone standing far enough back from the entrance that the light never found them. She closed the folder. She looked out the window at the dark moving past and the road ahead and the absence of anything between here and the horizon that she did not already know how to cross. The vehicle moved north. The desert held its silence, and somewhere behind them, in an arms room lit by a single desk lamp that was now dark, a challenge coin sat in the breast pocket of a jacket hung on a chair back, and the number on it, 0711 kilo, was not an ending. It had never been an ending. It was the name of the door that had already been opened, and the beginning of the question of who had been standing on the other side. Epilogue. The door. 3 weeks later. 04:15 a.m. The city had a different kind of dark than the desert. Fort Caldwell's darkness had been open and honest. Flat terrain, wide sky, the kind of dark that shows you exactly how far you are from everything. This city's dark was layered, buildings blocking sight lines, alleys creating corridors of deeper shadow within the general shadow. Light sources competing at every angle so that the darkness was never complete, but was instead a mosaic of orange streetlight and blue-white window glow, and the absolute black of spaces that no light source had claimed. Dahlia had been in position since 0200. She was sitting in the back corner of an all-night diner on the east side of a mid-sized American city, whose name was not in the operational brief because operational briefs don't name cities. They name coordinates, and the coordinates had brought her here. She had a cup of coffee in front of her that she had ordered at 02:15 and had not touched. It was cold now, which was fine. The coffee was not the point of the coffee. The point of the coffee was the table. The table gave her a direct sight line to the entrance, an oblique sight line to the kitchen corridor, and a reflected sight line, via the long mirror running behind the counter, to the parking area outside the front window. 3 angles of observation from a single fixed position. She had chosen the table in 4 seconds when she walked in, the way she chose everything, which was by seeing all the available options simultaneously and selecting the one that cost the least if it turned out to be wrong. The diner was not empty. At 04:15 a.m., a place like this never is. A trucker at the counter with a plate of eggs. 2 hospital workers in scrubs at the middle table, talking with the flat exhaustion of people at the end of a long shift. A young man near the window with a laptop and headphones, not looking at anything except his screen. A waitress who had been on her feet since 10 p.m. and moved with the precise economy of someone conserving exactly the right amount of energy to reach the end of her shift without running out. None of them were the reason Dahlia was here. The reason Dahlia was here was a man named in a document that had been handed to her in a vehicle 3 weeks ago, on a road running north from Fort Caldwell, with the desert dark moving past the windows. The document had given her a name and a location and a date. The name was not Brick. The name was not anyone who had ever set foot at Fort Caldwell. The name belonged to a man who had spent 12 years operating at a level of the system where names don't appear in searchable databases, and faces don't appear in any photograph filed with any agency that responds to standard records requests. The name belonged to the person who had recruited Brick, who had built the communication channel, who had identified the specific intelligence streams that Brick had access to, and had structured the transmission protocol to extract them without triggering standard monitoring systems. Who had done all of this with the methodical patience of someone who understood that the most durable intelligence operations are the ones that look from every available angle like something else entirely. Dahlia understood that methodology. She had spent 9 days at Fort Caldwell practicing a version of it. At 04:22 a.m., a car pulled into the parking area outside the front window. Dark blue mid-range model, the kind of car that is invisible in any parking area in any American city because it is exactly what every other car in that parking area looks like. It parked in the far left position, the position with the best sight line to the diner entrance and the fastest egress route back to the main road. Dahlia watched it in the counter mirror without moving her eyes from the middle distance in front of her. The driver sat in the car for 90 seconds before getting out. That was a surveillance detection pause. Not a long one, long enough to confirm that the space was as it appeared, short enough not to look deliberate to a casual observer. Dahlia lifted her coffee cup and set it down without drinking from it. A gesture, something for her hands to do that read as ordinary. The man who walked into the diner was 60 years old, or close to it, medium height, gray at the temples, the rest of his hair still dark enough to suggest the gray was recent. He wore civilian clothes. Nothing notable, nothing expensive, the clothing of a man who has learned that unremarkability is a form of armor. He moved through the entrance with the smooth, weight-balanced step of someone who has been trained to cover ground quietly, and he scanned the diner in a way that looked like a man simply orienting himself in a new space, and was actually a complete threat assessment conducted in under 4 seconds. His scan reached Dahlia's table. He stopped scanning. He stood in the entrance for 1 beat in a single contained moment of recognition and recalculation. And then he walked toward the counter and sat on a stool 2 positions from the trucker, with his back to the room, facing the kitchen corridor. Back to the room. Which meant he had decided, in the 4 seconds of his scan, that the room was clear, which meant he had not recognized Dahlia as a threat, which meant his assessment of her had been the same assessment that Sergeant Brick and Corporal Floyd and the rest of Fort Caldwell's logistics section had made. A small, quiet woman sitting alone with a cold cup of coffee. Unremarkable, not worth a second look. Dahlia set the coffee cup down. She thought about Brick standing in the mess hall saying supply clerk with a dragon tattoo, with the confidence of someone who believed that what he could see was the complete picture. She thought about how long that particular assumption had been working against the people who made it. She reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and removed a small device, the size and shape of a thumb drive, matte black, nothing written on it. She held it in her right hand below the table out of sight of every angle of the diner except the one directly above her, which was the ceiling, which was not watching. The device contained a program that would, when activated within range of a specific type of encrypted communication device, create a 40-second window during which the device's transmission log would be accessible to a secondary receiver. 40 seconds was enough. The operational brief had specified that the man at the counter would, within the first 5 minutes of any meeting with a contact, confirm receipt of the most recent transmission package through a brief, low-bandwidth handshake signal. A protocol so brief and compressed that standard monitoring systems read it as background noise. He was not here to meet Dahlia. He was here to meet someone else. At 04:31 a.m., the front door opened again. The person who walked in was a woman, late 40s, tall, dark coat, the purposeful walk of someone who knows where they are going. She went directly to the counter and sat 2 positions from the man, one stool between them. She ordered coffee from the waitress without looking at the menu, and when the coffee arrived, she wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at the surface of it. Neither of them looked at the other. To every person in the diner, they were 2 strangers who happened to arrive at the same counter at the same early hour. The trucker was absorbed in his eggs. The hospital workers were discussing something about a shift schedule. The young man with the laptop had not moved his eyes from his screen. Dahlia activated the device. 04:32 a.m. 40 seconds, she counted. The woman at the counter shifted her left hand slightly, a movement so small it was invisible unless you were watching for it, and Dahlia was watching for it because the operational brief had described exactly this gesture. The left thumb pressing briefly against the inside of the index finger, a motor habit the subject had developed over years of activating a specific type of control surface, a habit she was probably not aware she still had. 28 seconds. The man at the counter raised his coffee cup, set it down. A pause of approximately 3 seconds, the standard interval in the transmission protocol between the handshake signal and the confirmation receipt. 14 seconds. The device in Dahlia's hand registered a vibration. Brief, single pulse. Confirmation of successful capture. 04:33 a.m. She placed the device back in her inside pocket. She picked up her coffee cup, drank from it, cold, bitter, completely unpleasant, and set it back down. She did not look at the counter. She looked at the middle distance in front of her with the level, steady quality that had characterized every moment of her time at Fort Caldwell, and every moment before Fort Caldwell, and every moment she could honestly account for in the years of her operational life. She thought about what she had just captured. 40 seconds of transmission log, the secondary receiver, a system that did not exist in any standard technical manual, would, within the next 4 hours, decode the log and produce a communication record. That record would contain, among other things, the identity of the external contact on the other end of the 63 transmissions from the USB drive found in Brick's locker. The contact who was 2 steps above Brick in a chain that the operational brief estimated contained between 4 and 6 nodes, of which Brick had been node 1, and the woman at the counter was node 2, and the man at the counter was node 3. 3 nodes identified. Between 2 and 3 remaining. Dahlia put a $20 bill on the table, more than enough for the cold coffee and the 4 hours of occupying a corner booth in an all-night diner, and stood. She picked up her jacket, her document holder, her cover. She walked to the door with the unhurried, grounded step that covered ground without announcing it. At the door, she paused, not to look back. She had no reason to look back. She had everything she needed from this room, and looking back was not a habit she had cultivated. She paused because the door had a small rectangular window in it, and in the window, at this angle, she could see the reflection of the counter, and in the reflection she could see the man in the gray-templed hair lifting his coffee cup again, with a hand that was, at this proximity and this angle, visible below the sleeve. On the inside of his left forearm, partially covered by his sleeve, was a tattoo. Not a dragon, not the structured, deliberate ink of something rendered with intention and kept with care. This was older, smaller, a number, in the plain block style of a man who had not been celebrating when he got it. 7 digits, the kind of string that means something specific in a specific context and means nothing at all in any other. She could see 4 of the 7 digits from this angle and distance. She did not need to see all 7. She pushed through the door into the pre-dawn air. The city's particular dark closed around her, the layered, competing dark of a place where light and shadow negotiate constantly, and the result is never simple. She walked to the car parked on the side street, dark, nondescript, already running, the driver facing forward, and got in. The door closed. The car pulled into the street. "Capture confirmed," the driver said. He was young, early 30s, the kind of face that memory does not retain easily. "Confirmed." Dahlia was already opening the document holder. Inside it, the black notebook. She opened to the page with the name written 3 weeks ago and added 2 things below it. A number, 4 digits from a tattoo on a forearm, and a single-line notation in the angular script that no curriculum had produced. The driver pulled onto the main road heading west. The city moved past the windows. "There's a secondary location," the driver said. "Brief came in an hour ago. We have a 72-hour window." Dahlia looked at the notation she had just written. 72 hours was enough if the chain of evidence from tonight's capture decoded the way the operational brief predicted it would decode. If it didn't, 72 hours was still enough to establish the next position and wait. She had waited 9 days in a mess hall, absorbing deliberate humiliation for the sake of a USB drive. 72 hours in a secondary location was not a hardship. "Send me the coordinates," she said. The driver handed her a phone, already displaying a grid reference. She looked at it, committed it, handed the phone back. She looked out the window. The city was beginning its pre-dawn transition. The first delivery trucks on the main roads, the first windows showing light as early risers began their routines. The particular atmosphere of a place that is not quite night anymore, but is not yet committed to day. She had operated in this atmosphere many times. She had a specific relationship with it, the hour between darkness and light, when the people who had been awake all night were at their least vigilant, and the people who were supposed to be awake were not yet fully present. It was, in her experience, the most productive hour. She thought about the challenge coin in her breast pocket. 0711 kilo. 4 walked out. She thought about Fletcher, who was currently 3 time zones east of her, running his own thread of the same operation from a different angle. She thought about Ronan, who was back at Fort Caldwell running a firing range and knowing things he would never be cleared to discuss. She thought about Logan at 0500, with a blindfold, learning to trust his hands. She thought about Clover, who had seen more than she was supposed to see and had handled it with the quiet steadiness of someone who is going to be very good at something important someday. She thought about Norbert's nod, about Raymond's salute, about the way a formation of 62 soldiers had raised their hands simultaneously without being ordered to. She thought about how long it had taken, how much had been absorbed and cataloged and endured and waded through before the moment arrived, and how the moment, when it came, had been over in seconds. A torn sleeve, a number, a silence, a wave of raised hands, while the years of work that produced it were invisible to every person who witnessed it. That was, she had come to understand, the nature of the work. The visible moment is always the smallest part of it. The car moved through the pre-dawn city, and the city thinned at its edges into the roads that connect cities, and those roads opened into the early gray of a sky that had not yet decided what kind of day it was going to be. Dahlia opened the notebook to a fresh page. She wrote the grid reference. She wrote the 72-hour window. She wrote the 4 digits from the forearm tattoo and the connecting notation that linked them to the name from 3 weeks ago. Then she wrote a question, not because she didn't know the answer. She had a strong operational hypothesis, and the evidence from tonight's capture would either confirm it or redirect her, and either outcome was useful. She wrote the question because writing questions keeps you honest, because the moment you stop asking questions and start assuming answers, you become the kind of person who leaves a USB drive in a locker that gets found, or who grabs a stranger's sleeve in a parade yard without understanding what is written on the arm beneath it. She wrote, "Who told Node 3 that the Fort Caldwell channel was compromised? And how long before Brick was taken did they know?" She looked at the question. She capped the pen. Outside, the sky was making its decision. The gray was lightening at the horizon. Not dramatically, just steadily. The way things changed. A line of pale light extending in both directions as far as they could find. Dahlia closed the door. She placed it in the pencil. She looked at the horizon. A long time. Steady. The attention resolution was sufficient. They had been certain before. So had Brick. So had Floyd, in his smaller way. So had Carter. Certainty, Dahlia had observed across 14 years of operational work, is almost always a form of incomplete information. The car drove on. The horizon held its light. The notebook held its name. And somewhere in the chain, the long, patient, carefully constructed chain that had started with a door opened in a valley in Kandahar in 2009 and had not yet reached its end, the next link was waiting to be found. It would be found. That was not optimism. That was not confidence in any conventional sense. It was simply an accurate assessment of the available resources, the operational timeline, and the nature of the person sitting in the back of a car with a cold cup of diner coffee still faintly on her tongue, and a challenge coin buttoned into her breast pocket, and a name in a notebook. And 72 hours. 72 hours was enough. It had always been enough. It was just a matter of doing the work.